landscape management and connection with conflicts and migration fragility issues has been one of the themes that she has been championing in the bank. So I would like to first ask Paula for introductory remarks before we go to the panel. Thank you very much, Paula.
Thank you very much, and it's a real privilege and pleasure to join you today, particularly on such a distinguished panel, to deal with an issue that I think is very much at the core of the kind of development challenges we have going ahead. And what I think is fundamental is that if we really are going to turn the needle towards something that is sustainable and above all inclusive, we really have to just start by rethinking how we frame problems, how we even understand problems. And it's there that I think that the linkage between fragility, environment, conflict, migration, climate change has to be understood. This is not about tinkering at the edges and climate-proofing anything or trying to look at how we can nudge things one way or another. It is fundamentally about changing what kind of not development outcomes, but development trajectories we need, because this isn't about pulling people out of poverty. It is about pathways to keep people out of poverty. And I always say, we know what we need to do with today's poverty, but what are we doing about tomorrow's poverty? Are we creating the conditions for tomorrow's poverty? And if we are creating those conditions, what kind of resources are we going to have tomorrow to deal with those issues? Because I don't like to talk about things like ecosystem services or intergenerational equity, because it becomes big words that doesn't mean anything. But if we think about how what it is that we're going to need to do tomorrow to tackle the poverty, that sort of brings it home. And that's the issue. That's what we need to talk about today. And that's why, as Magda was saying, I sort of obsess so much about these kind of linkages. Another key aspect here has to do with the long-term vision, right? That tomorrow also brings in the long-term vision. We're not going to find the solutions tomorrow. It's not within the next project cycle or the budget cycle or the electoral cycle. What is the kind of commitment and what is the kind of metrics that we need to bring into this equation to start to have a better understanding of the linkages and how we can move the trajectories and those trends over the longer term? I don't want to overstate the linkages and the causality. There's, for example, many issues and many drivers to today's migration crisis, but I would argue that good environmental management, not environment understood as something that's out there about a protected area or some obscure species somewhere. No, environment understood as a main driver of long-term sustainable and inclusive growth. That is a key driver that we need to address when we're starting to need to look at issues related to conflict and migration. I was chairing the panel that was looking at the G7 study on the relationship between climate and fragility and conflict, and you start to see some very, very real causal links there. The fact is, though, that because we've ignored this for so long, because for so long environment has been the hidden externalities, the non-market value of the pollinator or the aquifer that's being replenished or the groundwater that is being provided, the clean water that is being provided, this has just not been seen as central to development. So all of this has been completely marginalized. And the end result is that in many countries, we're really facing tipping points in terms of resources that we call renewable, but turned out not to be so renewable. And those drivers have to do with security. It's about water security, food security. I like to think about food security. We're no longer talking about hunger. We're talking about long-term food security for feeding billions. That's the kind of reframing that we need to do in terms of how we understand these problems. I would also say that the positive message, though, is that it doesn't really have to be that way. We have the answers, we have the solutions, we have a lot of success stories. We have very dismal stories, such as the collapse of the Nova Scotia Great Banks cod fishery, on which so many millions of fishermen depended, and that has basically collapsed, and now it's starting to show signs of recovery, but it's been much slower and much more erratic than we had anticipated. And there's canaries in the gold mine out there that start to tell us that some things might not be right. But equally, there are amazing success stories. In Niger, for example, with large-scale tree regeneration of over 5 million hectares, it has allowed communities to withstand drought. So we are changing the dynamics and the equations in some of the most vulnerable regions of the world, which are the African drylands. Another study we did on modeling found that agroforestry could bring down the number of people vulnerable to drought by 13% in low tree density systems and up to 50% in high-density tree systems. So there are answers, but what we need and what is the importance of spaces like this Fragility Forum is that we are able to bring together different practitioners from different fields so that together is a unified, a multidimensional, multi-sectoral understanding of these problems, but we come together with a joined-up will to address them in a different way, to take on the challenges and the level of ambition that is necessary. So I continue to believe in the need for spaces like this to bring ourselves together so that we can have compelling messages and the kind of evidence to really change how high-level decision makers look at these issues, how they allocate budgets, and what kind of policies need to be put in place. So I'm delighted to be opening this session today, and I look forward to a very, very rich discussion. I can't stay for the whole of it, but I will stay here for as long as possible. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Paola. That has been really a very inspiring start and starting point for our discussion. I would like to introduce a very distinguished panel. Just very quickly, Colin Bruce, Senior Advisor in the Office of the World Bank President. Mariam Traor Chazal-Noel, expert on migration, environment, and climate change in the International Organization for Migration. Priti Aurora, Country Program Coordinator for Burundi, Malawi, Tanzania, and Somalia in the Africa region of the World Bank. Roger Mark de Souza, who is Director of Population, Environment, Security, and Resilience at the Wilson Center. Anton Barr, Senior Social Development Specialist in the World Bank, and Tim McCoy, Acting President of the World Cocoa Foundation. As you see, it's a very diverse panel with a lot of different types of experiences from public to private sector and non-government organizations. First, I would like to introduce and turn to Colin, who also very graciously accepted this invitation, even though he has to run very soon to another session that he is moderating. So we will benefit from his wisdom. But then he will need to leave. So Colin, you are now in the President's office advising the President and the World Bank on humanitarian issues, including the preparation of the first humanitarian summit at the heads of state level soon coming up in May. But previously in the Africa region, you were also leading large initiatives such as the Horn of Africa initiative, the Great Lakes Sahel together with the UN. In the context of humanitarian issues, often the focus is on policy, political issues, human issues. But you actually have been also quite sympathetic to the subject of addressing natural resource issues in connection with these humanitarian and conflict situations. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience, your views on this, and how do you see that in the upcoming summit?
Thank you. If I may, I'd like to make sort of 4 points or so very quickly. First of all, I was quite surprised when I began to delve into the theoretical literature and some of the empirical studies that this link between environmental degradation and migration is actually a very hotly disputed subject. And some of my distinguished colleagues at some of the most prestigious institutions have cautioned me that we should be extraordinarily careful when talking about any causal link between the environmental degradation and migration and even conflict. And in fact, just to be sure I was not dreaming when they said that to me, I went back and I checked some of the literature just before I came to this meeting. And indeed, that is a large body of argumentation that it's a much more complex phenomenon, and that in fact it's localized, and it's the localized conditions which in some sense explain what people do and also what people expect more than any objective consideration of the factors. And I found that quite startling, but I do want to begin with that because I want to acknowledge that we're covering a topic which might appeal to many of us at an intuitive and perhaps practical level, but it's still disputed among some of the policymakers and researchers. The second point I would make, though, is that notwithstanding the arguments by the analysts and by some of the researchers, they do make room for the fact that in localized conditions, this might in fact be a significant contributor to the movement of people. And I want to associate myself with some of those localized situations, because in one of my previous roles, as Magna said, I worked on what we call these regional initiatives that were trying to get at some of the cross-border drivers of conflict in 3 distinct regions of the world: the Sahel, the Great Lakes, and in the Horn of Africa. And just to pick up on the Sahel as an example, it's an area where about 75% of the land is arid or semi-arid. The Horn of Africa also has significant portions that are arid. There are also significant populations that are dependent on the land to live, particularly, to illustrate the point, pastoralists. Africa has about 50 million of the 120 million pastoralists in the world, and 20 million of those are in the Sahel. And they're competing for this arid land, for water, for grazing, with their animals and with many other people who feel that they are entitled to that land and those resources. So at least in these localized situations in the Sahel, but also in the Horn, in the case of the Great Lakes, it was slightly different. It had more to do with population density and dispute over land, as opposed to the aridness of the land. But the fact is that access to natural resources in these localized conditions was a considerable contributor, one, to conflict, to tension, and also to the movement of people. So that's my second point. At least in the conditions in which I have been working, this is quite relevant. Third, in the context of the current debate, certainly in Europe and elsewhere, there is, I think, an awareness that if not now, that sometime in the future, we might begin to see a much larger wave of people coming because of concerns about livelihoods linked to environmental degradation. And so in the Africa region, you may be aware, they have launched this climate plan, which is looking specifically at areas such as the Niger River Basin, the Lake Chad River Basin. As you know, these are in areas that are extremely fragile, and that there's already evidence of people moving from some of these areas up north towards places like Libya. And because of the instability of Libya and some of these other parts, you can well imagine that these resourceful individuals are finding other ways to opportunities elsewhere. So even if we can argue away what's happening right now and say it's linked perhaps more to Syria or more to Afghanistan or more to Eritrea, I don't think we can forever ignore the fact that at some level there is this kind of link. And it relates to Paula's point about the fact that the damage has already been done. Which brings me to my last point, that at the bank what we are trying to do is to catch up a bit and to make sure that our operational interventions are tailored to addressing some of these issues. And just to stay with the pastoralism example, just to stay with that, I'm very pleased that after some years of being away from this topic, we have been looking more and more at pastoralism, looking at it from the standpoint not just of the animals and the people, but also the landscape. And we are also beginning to see now a wave of demand from client countries to begin to look at some of these displacement issues, but also to link it back to the land. So there is an operation being prepared right now for the Horn of Africa. It has 3 components, and one of the largest components has to do with sustainable environmental management, having to do with stabilizing the environment in the host communities, the soils, the water conservation, trying to deal with afforestation, and so on. So there is at least, there are some building blocks. There is a degree of awareness. And I do think that your role as advocates, your role as TTLs, in raising the awareness, but also pushing what is essentially an opening door, is one that I would very much like to encourage. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Colin. I mean, this is really excellent to have a champion like you in the president's office, sort of forming the bank's position also on these issues in the global context, and certainly your support on the operational side before have been very much appreciated. So thank you so much for that quite comprehensive and very objective presentation that also recognizes some of the intellectual and research debates on the connection. So thank you very much, and thank you also for coming despite your double booking today. So appreciate that. Now, Colin mentioned things about what is the research, what is the evidence on the connection. So I'm turning now to Miriam, who at the International Organization for Migration is very much at the frontier of migration issues. And she's also an expert on migration, environment, and climate change, who was the IOM connection with the global climate negotiations. So I would like to ask Miriam, what evidence do you see, and particularly on the connection of land degradation, water scarcity, environmental fragility, and migration? And can you cite some examples from your experience? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Indeed, the question of evidence is really at the core of bringing the question of environmental and climate migration to the forefront, and to also support the policy process. As Colin said very clearly, it's very hard to establish a direct causality between climate change, environmental degradation, and the movement of people. We do have some statistics, but they pertain to natural disasters and the internal displacement of people. So with that, we already know that on average, 27 million people per year are displaced by an environmental disaster. So that only comprise environmental disasters, and it's only people displaced within their own countries. But if you think about 27 million people, it's already a very large number of people that needs to be taken care of. In addition to this disaster situation, of course, you have slow onset environmental degradation, and this is extremely difficult to quantify. And I don't think we'll actually ever be able to provide a number, an estimate on the number of people who are migrating because of slow environmental degradation processes like desertification or land degradation, simply because migration being a multi-causal complex phenomenon, it is very hard to isolate the weight of climate and environmental factor in the decision to migrate. Having said that, we are doing a lot of research. The International Organization for Migration is one of the main organizations looking at collecting evidence in the field. We are conducting a lot of research in many different countries all over the world, and we are getting some evidence that there are linkages. For instance, our field research tells us that in Kenya, pastoralist communities are modifying their traditional movements because of a risk of conflict with other settled communities or other pastoralist communities. So on the one hand, you have people who might move, who are obliged to move because they cannot stay where they are. But on the other hand, you also have other issues like pastoralist community in Morocco who are not able to move anymore because there is no place for them to go. So on the one hand, people might be forced to move, or they might decide to move preemptively. But on the other hand, they might not get the opportunity to move anymore, and this is as much of a problem as people being forced to move. On the question of land specifically, there's been a lot of political recognition, including within the UNCCD, the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification. The UNCCD has highlighted in their recent meetings that there is a link between land degradation and migration of people, that there might be a threat if nothing is being done, and that this is an issue that needs to go on the political and policy agenda. But again, we are missing evidence, and we really need to work hard at getting some concrete proof of this, of the nature of these links. And finally, in terms of land specifically, It's not just a matter of looking at people being forced to leave their land because they cannot stay there anymore. You can also look at this question from an opportunity perspective. So what do I mean by that? For instance, here at IOM, we are working on a project that is taking place in Burkina Faso, Niger, and Senegal. And we work with the diaspora members of these countries who are settled in Italy to try to encourage investment, financial transfers, but also skills transfers back towards their home countries with a specific focus on land adaptation. So with that, I just want to say that some things need to be done. We need to acknowledge that there is a link. We need to understand more about the nature of this link. But in the meantime, we can still start doing some concrete programming. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mariam. I think this question of how to use the knowledge that we have and some of the linkages that we understand there are, but maybe we don't have very strong evidence of, sort of do no harm and what makes sense. This is very much at the core of what the World Bank is doing also in designing programs in fragile situations and countries. So I'm turning to Preeti now, who has been coordinating country programs in quite a number of fragile countries and post-conflict countries, including Somalia, South Sudan, Burundi, so the question is from a country program design perspective, strategy perspective, how do you see this connection? How do we design programs in these fragile situations?
Thank you, Magda. So just, I wanted to start off by what Colin had said, that while there may not be really a clear causal link between environmental degradation and migration and conflict even, it depends on localized situations. And that's where I want to turn to, the localized situation where in Somalia, South Sudan, and Sudan, Burundi, how we see this, the impact of environmental degradation, the lack of environmental management, how it has contributed to conflict. I mean, it's not the only cause of conflict, but the majority of the people depending on land in these countries, whether as farmers or as pastoralists, that's their livelihood. And what is happening with the degradation of land and with the problems caused by, for example, in South Sudan, the average temperatures have been rising over the years. The rainfall has become more erratic. It's become less and less over the years. Or it is just a lot of rainfall in certain years. So there is a huge variability in the factors that affect the productivity of the very meager plots of land that people have. And this is obviously affecting not only their livelihoods, but they have to think about how they can survive. So leading to contestation of land itself, within communities, across communities, really fueling the conflict, that the fragile environment that they're living in already for many other factors, ethnic factors, lack of services provided by the government, so just general deprivation, but combined to that, the fact that they themselves are so helpless in supporting their own livelihood. So there is encroachment, there is conflict, as I said, between communities, which can flare up. Not only conflict within the farming communities, between farmers, but we look at the pastoralists. Somalia is 70% arid and semi-arid. 60% of the population depends on pastoralist activities, livestock activities. And with the droughts that more and more are being faced by these pastoralists, they are, and South Sudan as well, I must say, they're encroaching the land that is used by farmers. So there is this conflict also between the pastoralists and the farmers. So just making the situation even worse. So there is really a need to see how we can create conditions. And it's unfortunate that in these conflict environments, the priorities of the government is not really on environmental management. It's just a fact. There are way too many problems that they're facing now, the firefighting that has to be done, that managing the environment, managing the risk of disasters is really not in the mind. They think that is the task of the rest of the world, the humanitarian organizations, the World Bank, or or even sometimes neighboring countries. When it leads to migration, when people leave from Somalia, people leaving to go to Kenya, it becomes the responsibility in some way of the Kenyan government, Kenyan people, United Nations, or anybody else who is able to, or who is inclined to support these migrants and these refugees who come to the other countries. So in that sense, it's not really foremost in the minds of the authorities. And I think in certain respects, the role of organizations like ours, when we are not humanitarian organizations, but really oriented towards development, and we want to see more long-term, it is how we can make the lives of these people better so that the dependence on humanitarian aid declines. So what we have been doing is, in our small programs, in what little resources we have, and there are competing priorities, so I will not say that it is the top priority in our programming as well, but definitely it is not neglected. It is part of our program, taking the example. And then I'll give you a couple of examples of how we have been approaching it, but some of the countries, for instance, Somalia and Sudan, they don't even have IDA resources. They are not eligible for concessional financing from ourselves and from the other multilateral organizations. So we've had to look for grant money. And one really a great source of financing to help with managing the environmental issues is the GEF, the Global Environment Facility. There is also the Climate Fund. So we have been reaching out to see how we can take advantage of these opportunities, and we have continuous dialogue with the government, making them understand that if you don't, as Paulo, you said, unless we start to plan for tomorrow, today, we're not going to be able to do what we need to do tomorrow. So it is just to keep them engaged and to make sure that it is part of their thought process, and each country has a Ministry of Environment. I mean, there is an institution, however dysfunctional it may be, but there is an institution that has a mandate. Whether they are able to fulfill their mandate or not is completely a different question, So in our role as a development organization and with our limited resources, we've been trying to use these different trust funds that are available to help with watershed management programs, or to help with responding to the threat of El Nino right now for Somalia and in the Horn. That is a big problem. So we're trying to see how we can train some of the staff in these governments to understand the threat and then to help them prepare. We recently had a workshop in Kenya, which was organized by IGAD and some of us together, to see how we can bring this knowledge at least to key people in the government, and then you can start to build an action plan. And then, of course, finding resources is always very critical. So I think I will stop here right now and then have any follow-up discussion.
Thank you very much, Priti. It is really quite exciting that in some of these fragile countries we have managed to put on the ground programs that deal with some of these land degradation, environmental fragility issues. So let me now turn to Roger Mark, who is Director of Population Environment, Environmental Security and Resilience at the Wilson Center. Roger Mark, you are leading programs on climate resilience, environmental security, including the Global Sustainability and Resilience Program and the Environmental Change and Security Program. So there are a lot of these new concepts, environmental security, demographic resilience. Can you tell us how these programs deal with these issues that we are discussing? What are they doing about these concerns?
Thank you very much, Magda. I'd like to start by just noting this morning at 1 o'clock, Berta Caceres, who is was the coordinator and co-founder of the Indigenous Peoples of Honduras, was murdered at 1 o'clock this morning. She had been working to advance indigenous rights in Honduras, particularly focusing on how her community was being displaced and how it was tied to natural resource management, environmental challenges, and women's rights. Last year, she was the Goldman Environmental Prize winner, and we hosted her at the Wilson Center. And it was very interesting as I chatted with Berta about her work. It was interesting to see that these concepts that we think are so new are very much real, very much localized, as we have mentioned, and very much alive in these communities. So I want to talk about that framing and Berta's legacy, her having just been murdered this morning, to recognize that there are three really important components that we should be focusing on from my perspective. And I will call those the three R's. The first R for me is this question of resilience and what resilience means. And one of my colleagues very often says when we work on development issues that we need to move away from this notion that we need to simplify things. Let's move away from the simplifiers and embrace more complexifiers. And by that, we're recognizing that causality is not necessarily direct. It's a complex picture operating on the ground. And if we want to have successful development programming, we need to embrace that complexity and figure out operational mechanisms to deal with that complexity at various scales, taking into account a landscape perspective and landscape resilience and what that means. So for us, when we talk about environmental security and environmental resilience in that context, we recognize that there are key intersections between natural resource management, climate change, and security considerations at various scales, and that they take into account questions around natural resource capture, scarcity, and resource curses, and the dynamics around those issues, that they interact with social, economic, and political grievances to exacerbate existing conflict. So we recognize this complexity. We add to that the question of demographics. And in particular, we look at age structure and recognize the role of disenfranchised young men. We look at population growth in urban centers. And we look at violations of women's rights and what this means for conflict and how it serves as a threat multiplier when combined with climate change impacts. And additionally, an important framework that we look at from our landscape resilience partners, folks, for example, like eco-agriculture partners, they recognize that livelihood and landscapes are inherently tied and has very clear connections to displacement, migration, and movement. So that framing and resilience has led to a number of conclusions for us. We have seen through programming on the ground that migration, when there's increased environmental insecurity, migration results in migration to marginal lands and urban areas. There's diminished economic activity. It increases the possibility of resource capture by elites. It weakens state capacity and state legitimacy, a very important component in terms of what action is possible. It exacerbates other causes of conflict like ethnic or income divisions, and it presents a greater risk from threat multipliers like climate change. So that's an overall framing for us in terms of resilience, which we think is important. So the second R that I want to talk about is risk, and we were talking a little bit about this, Anton. How do you talk about the risk framework? How do you identify that and make that operationalizable in a real and meaningful way? So most recently, and Paula alluded to this earlier, we worked with the G7 to do an analysis of climate fragility and risk, and we produced a report, an analysis called A New Climate for Peace, where we identified 7 compound risks tied to climate and fragility, and these focus on reduced access to natural resources, questions around livelihoods of people and displacement, so very important, that framework on agricultural systems and migration, extreme weather events and disasters, food insecurity, transboundary water disputes and opportunities for peace building, rising sea levels, and unintended consequences of poorly designed mitigation and adaptation efforts, what we call sort of a backlash effect that is important. So we took this framework, this analytical framework of looking specifically at risks to the G7, and they said, great. This is really important, and they have now formulated a working group that's looking at how you make this real. And Secretary Kerry has also established a working group at the State Department that is mainstreaming this risk analysis and framework for the State Department's efforts. So finally, what does this mean for us in terms of that third R? So you have the questions around resilience, you have your risk framework. What's the third R? What's the response? And our response has really focused on recognizing that there are key areas that we need to be focusing on that are tied to early warning and assessment, planning, financing, and implementation, and developing tools for integration across those 4 sectors. So I'll give you a very quick example. We have worked with partners in the Sahel, and I'm pleased to hear the Sahel kept coming up in earlier comments, to figure out what this means. How do you plan across the ecosystems in the Sahel for climate fragility and risk and bring in demographic factors? We have conducted a training with partners in the Sahel that looks at how agronomists are planning for this, what it means for food security, and how you bring that together with women's efforts around women's empowerment, and how that leads to overall donor coordination within the Sahel. So USAID and other partners, for example, have been using that methodology to develop an approach across geographies and donors through joint planning cells, reaching out also to the humanitarian community and their dashboard assessment of risks in the Sahel that goes across these sectors. So very concrete efforts are being made in the region that's recognizing that you need to think about resilience, you need to look at these risk factors and develop very concrete, specific operational actions across a variety of sectors. And that is what's going on now.
Well, Roger, Mark, I think this is really a great sort of opening the discussion to the more complex challenges, including some of the social, demographic, and other challenges. In addition to some of the sort of more concrete natural resource management ones, to highlight that the issues are very complex and they need complex responses as well. I would like to lead now this discussion to coming back a little bit to the World Bank and some of the programs that we have been supporting, including the Sahel, that has a lot of mention already. Anton is, as a senior social development specialist, has been working on a range of fragile situations, post-conflict situations from Uganda to Rwanda, Sierra Leone, Cambodia, and recently also quite a bit on these African initiatives that Colin mentioned, including the Sahel and Horn of Africa. So we have operations planned and approaches that take, I think, some of the complex approaches that you mentioned, Roger, Mark. So I would like to ask you, Anton, if you could tell us a little bit about your experience with these programs and more generally your experience with post-conflict situations and how we can design programs that also take into account the landscapes, the natural resource management aspects.
Well, thank you. This is, I appreciate Roger saying it's complex. And I'm then the guy that says it's complex and get hammered for saying it's complex and say, make it simple, because you have to do the risk framework of our interventions. I think, let me challenge the title of the session a bit. And I don't know how to understand it. I think mobility is good. I think migration is good. I think that's always happening. I think there is a part around the legal frameworks that are not up to date with the push and pull factors that we are experiencing. I think that the sense of global crisis is very much determined by Europe waking up to what the rest of the world has been living with for a long time. So just to put things in perspective. Also, I think important to let you know, even though we have a fragility forum at the bank, what we really are about is trying to strengthen resilience. Right? The fragility is the diagnostic part of things. What I think, and I think, Roger, that was the conversation we were having, is it's very much about a convergence of risk and weaknesses in managing those risks, weaknesses in understanding the interplay of risks. So I think when you get to operations, what I like about the landscape approach is that it is one example of moving the unit of analysis beyond the givens of nation states. These issues we are dealing with are transboundary issues. They are determined by different parameters. We're looking at functional ecological regions. We look at functional cultural regions. Livelihood systems that move beyond. And I think if we don't acknowledge that, and if we try to fit our diagnostics with, in the end we have a hammer, so we'll analyze this until you need a hammer. So what does it mean? I think that we need to look at what are the factors, what are the system analysis, and I think that this is the unifier between the social science and the ecological sciences. It's about systems analysis. How do these systems interact? And what then are the boundaries and the interactions between these systems? So if I move this to northern Uganda, I was part of, not for the bank, but I was part of negotiating peace with the Lord's Resistance Army. And if you notice what happened when we succeeded in getting the LRA out of northern Uganda into South Sudan, and people could move out of the IDP camps, we had one of the greatest floods again in northern Uganda. So northern Uganda, if you look at the human security angle of things, temperature rises of 1% just destroys your coffee economy. You have the water issue and the floods and people moving within that space. Now, I think it's a classical example of what we didn't understand, what we put in the assumption part of our log frames. So I think we have an opportunity to look at the evidence base, but not analyze towards the spaces we are comfortable with. And I think landscape is excellent. I think it brings to the conversation if understanding cross-boundary spaces from a political ecology type of angle. We do that too little. The bank moves to political economy. I think then that if we move forward in understanding the interplay of risk, we have to look at sort of a triangle of political economy, political geography, and political ecology. And one fact in Africa, I work in the Africa region now, and what you mentioned, urban spaces, 40,000 people per day are moving into urban spaces in Africa. We will not be able to fix rural landscapes so that they become livelihood bearing for the type of people pressures that are going into those places. So there is inevitably in Africa, how do you get to move people to places where actually growth takes place, where human advancement takes place, and where the pursuit of happiness can take place. So again, the evidence base of this, we need to have a different diagnostic framework. I think the bank is working towards that. It needs to be one that understands resilience risk, managing resilience risks. We need to move beyond the unit of, we need to have better alignment between the unit of diagnostics that we have and the unit of intervention. There's a total mismatch. So we have great analytical work, and then we just can't put it into operations. I think lastly then, a bit of call on the migration. IOM, I think, is underexposed within the bank in thinking around the forced displacement mobility issue. We have worked very hard in the bank to work on forced displacement from the Geneva 51 conventions. Within that, we say, year in, year out. And some of our main shareholders say, well, do more of that. And there is a simplistic solution in the air of saying, if you just do development better in those dry places, people will stay there. Right? That's where I leave it. I don't think I can be more clear. That's what I would like to discuss. The simplicity of make better landscapes, let people stay there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anton. Clearly a very interesting perspective and very, very practical from your experience. We have discussed so far a lot of the sort of broad concepts, the approach, how we plan projects, how we advise governments to address these issues, build capacity. There is another angle of it, of course, is the private sector, and how does the private sector come into this picture? Tim McCoy, you are acting president for the World Cocoa Foundation, and you have had about 20 years of experience in working on international affairs, economic development programs, a lot of it in Africa. How do you see the big concerns of multinational companies in working in fragile situations? I mean, there is always a concern about risks in the supply chain, how the private sector can get involved in operations in fragile and post-conflict type situations. What is your experience in this area, and what is the private sector's approach, and what can the private sector, how it can contribute to reducing these risks or managing them?
Thanks very much, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to be here today to address this issue through the specific lens, I guess you will, of cocoa. And what I'll try to do is give a little bit of background on cocoa, some of the ways that we at the World Cocoa Foundation, through our members, are viewing some of the issues that we're addressing today, and then specifically some of the actions that we're taking to try to instill more resilience, more productivity into the cocoa farming communities, particularly in West Africa. I would say, in terms of, looking at the questions of resilience and fragility and conflict, this is not an option when it comes to the cocoa supply chain. This is a must, because we're dealing with geographies that produce up to 70% of the world's supply of cocoa. So if there's not resilience in those areas, there's not cocoa. And it's as simple as that. In some instances, I know I previously worked for another member-based association of companies that were interested in promoting economic development in Africa. And, there's a very different environment where you have a multiplicity of companies that are engaged in numerous sectors and take a look at these issues in various ways, and I dare say in ways that aren't always specifically connected to the company's bottom line. With cocoa, it's all about the bottom line. If there's a failure in these areas, there's a failure in the industry across the board. So I think it's interesting to keep that in mind and useful to keep that in mind. As I mentioned, 70% of the world's supply comes from West Africa. Côte d'Ivoire alone produces about 40% of the world's supply of cocoa. About 2 to 3 million people in that region depend on cocoa for their livelihoods. It's a smallholder crop. Sometimes when we talk about commodities, people tend to think of large-scale operations, plantations and whatnot. That's not the case with cocoa at all. These are smallholder farms, average of 3 or 4 hectares, family-run operations to the large degree. It's a tree crop. What does that mean? It takes this tree about 5 to 7 years to reach productivity. So investments today start to yield returns only down the road. There's not an immediate return on this. And in some respects, in connection with the questions of migration particularly, it's viewed in this region as a reliable source of income. You can debate the price of cocoa or whatnot, but at the farm level, at the level of people taking a look at what is a profitable pursuit for me, in places like Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, cocoa is seen as a reliable source of income. In other words, it's an attractive part of agriculture to get involved in. So WCF, World Cocoa Foundation, is made up of about 110 chocolate and cocoa companies from around the world. We're a nonprofit, and our mission is to promote sustainability in the cocoa value chain. When we take a look at conflict, and as it's related to cocoa, we see conflict being the result of diminishing natural resources, competition for fertile land, ownership of the land tenure issues. These all factor into sources of conflict in the cocoa space, if you want to call it that. There's a potential for conflict between communities, between farmers, conflicts between multinationals and governmental institutions, conflict between farmers groups and government institutions. So sufficient material there for conflict at a number of levels. And more recently, I think in a place like Côte d'Ivoire, where the government is beginning to take steps to expel people who encroached on formerly protected forests and other lands, there's of course source of conflict there as the government steps in and tries to make good on its commitment to again, after years of instability, again to protect those areas. Fragility, we see that playing out in a number of different ways. You have old and low, old farms that are reaching the end of their productivity, impoverished soils, partly as a result of poor farming practices in the past or lack of knowledge about good agricultural practices. Of course, I've already touched on deforestation, the impact of decreased biodiversity and how that impacts a farm and its productivity, and then all of these or any one of these can lead to one of cocoa's biggest threats, and that's increased pest and disease, something that we deal with all the time. We're of course looking at how things like deforestation feed into the climate change problem. And again, it gets, as I said at the beginning, our companies see this as a bottom line issue because there are predictions that there could be up to a 70% decrease in land suitable for cocoa growing by 2030 as a result of climate change. So leading to an overall decrease in productivity. Cocoa is an interesting crop in the sense that it can be a cause of deforestation, but it also presents some pretty interesting potential for agroforestry systems and for being a profitable crop that can be successfully grown in a forestry environment. We've seen examples of this particularly in Brazil, where it seems there's even evidence that cocoa does better in those kind of systems rather than, as is often the case in West Africa, where it's a full sun crop and the forest has completely been eradicated to make way for monocropping of cocoa. So what are we doing about this, both as an organization and through our member companies, many of which are carrying out activities at the farm level in places like Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire? First and foremost, one of the things that we are looking at is training farmers and increased productivity practices. And when I say increased productivity, I'm talking about intensification, not extensification. Working with farmers to know that they can, with the right agricultural practices, they can produce as much, if not more, cocoa on the land that they have now, even in some cases freeing up land so that they can diversify the crops that they grow. We're involved in distributing improved cocoa planting materials that are higher yield, that are more likely to resist pests, and we're also supporting research into drought-resistant variety of cocoa as we look at the climate change problem. Diminishing conflict through public-private partnerships, something that we have championed since our very earliest days back in 2000, working with donor agencies, also perhaps more importantly, working very closely with local institutions, local agricultural research institutions, coffee and cocoa boards, and others, so that there's an aligned approach between industry and government in tackling these problems. It's an opportunity for us to bring some of the problems to the attention of the governments, perhaps for the first time. And we're doing this through a strategy announced about 2 years ago called Cocoa Action, which has a double focus on productivity and community development, and has as its foundation alignment with government strategies on cocoa. We are additionally looking at development of climate-smart productivity practices that are adapted to specific areas: soil management, pruning, the good agricultural practices that I spoke about a while ago, shade management, getting back to the agroforestry concept, that's, again, specifically adapted for a farmer's region. Soil fertility, the soil characteristics vary, as you can well imagine, from region to region, so it's important for us to understand what inputs are best adapted to the farmer's local realities. And I think to sort of round it all off, one of the things that we are seeing as an increasingly important role for ourselves is just to educate our partners about the environmental impact of cocoa, the link between that and questions being posed by climate change, and how we can work together to begin to address some of these things. In listening to some of the earlier conversations where we're talking about the link between migration causing degradation, degradation causing migration, I think we increasingly are looking at migration, as especially in the protected forest areas of Cote d'Ivoire, where the country that has achieved record cocoa harvest over the past couple years. And as you start to look at how they achieve those harvests, you start asking yourself some really tough questions about how much of that increased crop came from protected areas, and what's going to happen both to the country's economy as a whole and to the individual farmers as the government tries to take control of this phenomenon of increased encroachment on protected areas. I'll stop there.
Well, thank you very much, Tim. I think this question of the cross-sectoral conflict is certainly not something new, including protected areas, agriculture, other aspects of land use, which we are dealing with almost on a daily basis in our projects. So we now heard a lot of various perspectives from NGO perspective, private sector, international organizations, the World Bank teams. I wonder, you don't know each other, I suppose, very well, and this is an opportunity also for you to interact. So I would like to just throw up the question whether you have any reactions to each other's interventions, anything that you see as new or informative in your work, and then also what you expect from the different parties. There was already some comment about IOM's role and how much we rely on the work that IOM does. perhaps also some reflections of what the bank is doing and how it uses some of the international experience. So I wonder if any of you would want to react to that. And then I would like to also ask the audience, since we like to use these occasions to interact rather than just have speeches. So if you have questions to any of the panel members, please come to the mic and let's prepare. So I would like to ask Miriam.
Thank you very much. I think what came out of all of these conversations for me, it's the necessity to acknowledge that there is a complex phenomenon occurring, but that we can do something about it. And I think it was you, Anton, who said that it's not as simple to ensure that we repair degraded areas, to ensure that people are not going to move. It's not just a matter of having an intervention that is just focusing on one aspect or another. So for me, that's what I'm getting from this panel, that it's not enough to just look at the question from just one perspective. And two, that there is also the matter that migration can potentially also be a positive answer to very negative phenomenon. So it's not just about trying to prevent people leaving, but maybe if they have to go, or if we consider that we might be better off by leaving, then we can also work at supporting that. Thank you.
Great. Well, this is an interactive discussion. So, Anton, if you want to respond.
Yeah, and I hope also that there must be people who know more about this in the audience than I do. You see, the interesting part for me is that we don't know how to deal with flows of people. A lot of what we do is about places, right? And the challenge we face is that, you know, we're a bank. We actually think migration is good because you look where your opportunities are and you try to maximize those. Now, so again, to what do we have as an outlook? And as part of the international community, and we have lots of work on migration. But what we don't have is, so how do we deal with that? And if you look at the landscape, I like landscapes, I like spatial planning, but then I think, well, what about people who want to move out of that landscape? That's also the people that we need to be concerned with. So from the social angle and this is part of the follow the COP21 on the Africa Climate Business Plan, is trying to understand this migration and climate change. And actually, there's this concept of trapped populations, which is really fascinating. Now you can be mobile and trapped, right? So think about a young pastoralist who sees, I can move, but I'm not getting anywhere. So he moves into an urban slum area, leaves behind his mother and probably some kids. How do we deal with the vulnerabilities of those populations? And one of the mega trends we know is happening is that you have this convergence of risk in marginal lands in border areas, where you find the hardest to deal with extreme poor. So if we want to achieve our goal of ending extreme poverty, we need to find out how to get to those groups. And I think there, for me, and I've worked with IOM in different settings for 20 years, and it's sometimes they're the cowboys sometimes of this game if you go to demobilization, right? But if you see what's coming out of IOM in terms of thinking with different legal frameworks and how to frame the client dialogues that we also need to frame, how to frame the right to work. West Africa, ECOWAS has a migration policy, the right to work. Other regional economic commissions don't have that. We as the bank, we're not very good at engaging at that level. That's what I want to say. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Anton. Of course, some of you might remember the World Development Report a few years ago that dealt with economic geography and the fact that actually migration to agglomerations actually has a lot of positive development outcomes, while we have to deal with somehow the lagging regions and the areas that have very limited potential for supporting especially growing populations. But I think we are also dealing with a different type of migration now, which is the completely unplanned and undesired size of migration that creates very large social and demographic challenges. And I think that's sort of raises it into a different level than what the normal rural-urban transition type migrations might entail. But any other reactions from the panel?
Okay,
Preeti.
thank you. This was very interesting to hear my colleagues here. Just a quick comment on the migration and displacement. I mean, there is a genuine difficulty in identifying what is forced displacement and what is, displacement that is intentional. I mean, I think even now when we look at the migration into Europe, a lot of that is genuine, just getting out of conflict situations, but we would not know how many of those people who are leaving are actually trying to take advantage of this worldwide attention and migrate because of other reasons, of whether it is due to the environment degradation or their livelihoods are affected not just by the conflict directly but indirectly, which is conflict affecting their landscapes or their livelihood opportunities there. So there is, and then again, even when we, in the Africa region or in the Horn of Africa, basically the study that has been done on displacement, these issues are again being considered, whether it is, how do we define forced displacement? And what are the different factors that lead to forced displacement? And which are the ones that get more attention and that get a response from the receiving entities? That's I think something to consider. I had one small question for Tim. Tim, you mentioned a lot about your work in West Africa, and one of the countries that I work on, Burundi, has a massive potential for coffee. I mean, it's a big coffee grower, although it's currently in quite a difficult situation. So I was just curious to know whether the World Coffee Board also has members from East Africa. We have coffee production in Ethiopia, in Burundi, where and what efforts is the organization making to improve the lives of these smallholder farmers? Thanks.
Well, I guess the most direct answer is we don't have anything against coffee, but we focus on cocoa. So. But I think since you mentioned coffee, I think it's worth pointing out that here you have another crop which provides livelihoods for millions of people, and climate change is already having an impact, and not just in Africa, but in other geographies where coffee is important. So it's, even though we don't focus on it, it's important to not lose sight of it.
I needed some coffee.
I can give you some hot cocoa. If I may, one of the observations that I've had about the conversation up here on migration, especially the comment that Anton made about some migration is good, and I'm not an expert on these issues, but from our vantage point, one of the real challenges that we're looking at is the negative impact of migration away from farming communities, and the challenges that poses for a sustainable supply of the commodity that we're most interested in. But more broadly than that, how do you keep these rural communities viable? I've seen it in my own life. In my own life experience, I grew up on a farm, and the understanding was, you get an education and you leave. Well, if everybody leaves, what's left? And how do we address those challenges?
Thank you, Tim.
I can make it.
Georgia
I
Marquez.
know we want to get to the audience, but a couple of very quick comments. I was very glad that Anton once again came back to the legal framework and the right to work. These are some of the conversations we have been engaging with the ILO on, and particularly looking at the demographic dividend for Africa and what that means and how that's tied to climate change impacts. Another key component for us when we look at this from a security angle and we work with peace builders and the peace building community who do not necessarily always recognize the connections to climate nor to natural resources, is the importance of institutional building for peacemaking and what that means. And I think we see that as an important component that is if not reinforced, very often will lead to what we refer to as resilience deficits. And this is particularly salient in a conflict setting. So I think that's a really very important component where we think there are lots of opportunities for action. And then, Tim, I just wanted to reflect and say to you, in some of my conversations with colleagues in the private sector, and we talk about how do you develop methods and approaches to measure resilience in a food security context, particularly with small-scale farmers. Some of my colleagues in the private sector talk about how profitability is perceived and how they are very often criticized for working with small-scale farmers to put forward profitability as a meaningful measure of resilience, because that is seen as profit-making as opposed to enhancing resilience at various scales. And that is particularly salient in a context of fragility that's tied both to climate change impacts and disruption. And that is something that I see emerging from the private sector. How do we talk about measures of resilience from a private sector perspective at various scales, and what is innovative in that arena, and how the bank can be supporting work in that area?
Well, Tim, would you want to answer?
Well, through the Cocoa Action Strategy, we recently did come up with an extensive set of KPIs for the different components of the strategy, such as proper application of inputs, school attendance, and so forth. So we actually shied away from using profitability, even at the farm level, as one of the measures for success under this strategy.
Great. I see some hands, so if you would not mind walking to the mic here and line up, and you can start asking questions of the panel.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for a very broad-reaching set of issues and discussions. I just wanted to comment. Oh, I'm Kanta Kumari. I'm from the climate policy team, and I work on the adaptation resilience agenda. I wanted to come back a little bit to Roger's framework, which I think is a very useful one in terms of building on resilience and looking at risks. And particularly, I think I want to focus on the response. And but just very quickly, I think several speakers touched on the fact that a lot of the fragility, conflict, and migration aspects play out at a local level. And I think while they do play out at a local level, the drivers are not necessarily within the local remit. And I think, at various points, I think the climate issues come up. And this is a global driver that is obviously, working and undermining at multiple scales the potential for communities, households, and I think even landscapes to be resilient. And when we think about the response, at least from the bank's perspective, I want to be very short on this, is I think that while I think the humanitarian and the disaster community needs to do what it needs to do, I think from the bank's perspective, I think we do need to plan our development trajectories very differently. I mean, we heard from the Cocoa Foundation, and I mean, we've already heard how cocoa companies are moving from West Africa to Vietnam because
they go by where, maybe the suitability of it is. But when you talk about migration of people, I mean, I think unless we plan it differently and we understand how these impacts are going to cascade down at multiple levels, I think that will not change the conversation in decades to come. I think we need to take that broader spatial and temporal look at the conversation. And I just wanted to hear from the panel as to how that's playing out in your different organizations and also from the bank's perspective.
Thank you, Kanta. I suggest that we hear a few of the questions and collect, and then have the panel respond.
Sure, thanks.
Please introduce yourself.
My name is David Jensen. I'm with the UN Environment Program. I have a question really for Anton, and you mentioned the fact that there's this disconnect between laws and push-pull factors, massive disconnect. And I'm wondering if you can comment a little bit on the question of land tenure and this tension between traditional land tenure systems and statutory systems, and how that tension is being resolved, especially in dryland areas, and what are sort of best practices for resolving that tension. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Yuka Makino. I work in the South Asia Climate Change and Disaster Risk Management Unit. But why I wanted to comment right now was I wanted to add to the complexity of this whole discussion that we're having today. Because, for example, when I was working in Tanzania, we had a whole influx of refugees from Burundi and Rwanda in that whole conflict, but the whole humanitarian assistance was given to the refugees, but the people who were living there, they had 90,000 people coming in, they had their natural resources destroyed, their water sources, their the forests and everything cut down by the incoming refugees were largely ignored. So my job there was to help them with the land use planning, so that in the future when they have these refugees coming in. So I was just wondering if other organizations actually do that as well and focus on the people who have to receive these refugees. And this is a refugee situation, but in other situations that we've been talking about, how we can go about helping communities who might potentially receive these refugees. And the second thing is, I wanted to touch upon one of the comments that was made about people who want to move. I work with landslides in Nepal, and they asked, the communities I was working with, they asked me, how much money are you spending on preventing these landslides? And I gave them the amount. We're very transparent. They're like, can you give us that money? We want to go somewhere else. So it's like you're faced with this conflict of, we're there to help them, make them more resilient, but maybe the people want to get out of that situation, because a lot of times people who live in risky areas are there because they're poor. They have no other choice but to live there. So I was just wondering if you have any ideas of how we deal with the situation, and whether the bank, I know when we're doing reconstruction after a disaster, a lot of times we have to move people to a safer area, but if other organizations are doing that where people want to move, and you just give them the money to move, so that's...
Questions?
Thanks, panel. My name's Mark Robinson. I lead governance work at the World Resources Institute. Thanks for a really focused set of contributions. It's great. I would really be interested to hear about evidence or experience that any of you are aware of systematic public or private investments in a number of areas to improve resilient landscapes. So take whether it's reforestation, improvements in land, strengthening tenure, improving water scarcity, or indeed investments that link those together, and outcomes around, which were mentioned today, around not only improving livelihoods and strengthening resilience, but also reducing conflict. Do we have an evidence base around that? I think you all quite rightly highlighted the lack of a clear evidence base on climate and conflict, but do we have a more positive evidence base that shows how large-scale investment achieves multiple goals in this way? Thank you.
Thank you to the panel. Mark Bulmer. I've worked in GFDR before. I'm currently have been brought into the Ministry of Defence in the UK. The reason that I'm in there is because I've been moving around different communities, the humanitarian community, in this case the defence community, and more recently coming into the development sector. One of the things that really struck me from your presentation is I'm not hearing anything that's coming from the physical sciences. I heard you talk about climate change. I didn't really hear anybody talk about extreme weather. And this is a manifestation not just in terms of temperature, but real fundamental changes to the very fabric of the landscapes that you're talking about. So there are a whole host of things that are going on, and there is an enormous revolution that has happened within the physical sciences and the data that is being pushed out, which goes to the comment about complexity, and obviously in an institution like this, my question really to everybody in the panel is trying to understand how each of you are becoming informed about the physical and natural operating environment as it's changing, because I'm not hearing that from any of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for all the questions. What I would suggest is that we go just quickly one by one, and you pick your answers and see if we have all the answers, and then we'll see if there are any unresponded or unanswered comments or questions. So Miriam, can we start with you?
Thank you. I will try to be brief. So on the question of how to support people to move out of risky areas if they want to, we already have some examples of, for instance, establishing labor migration schemes, for instance, between Colombia and Spain, or between some Pacific islands and Australia and New Zealand. So here you have a framework that is put in place that allows people who are living in degraded areas to move and find employment opportunities abroad, usually for a specifically short period of time. But these kind of schemes are only in their starting. A lot more needs to be done, but these are some of the answers that we can bring to this question of how to support people who want to move out. On the question of the links with the scientific community, it's a very interesting question. On our side, the International Organization for Migration, we have a lot of links with universities, especially in the UK, who are working from the science side, who are contributing to projects like the HELIX, which is High Impacts Climate something, I'm sorry for the acronym, but the bottom line is I think there is a lot more linkages that are being established between international organizations and universities who are working on the scientific aspect. And again, more needs to be done, but there's already a relationship.
Thank you. Preeti.
Okay, thank you. I think it's very interesting points have been raised, and I agree with most of them. I just want to pick up on a couple of those. First one, since I work also on Tanzania, and I know exactly what you're talking about, the Burundian refugees, which have been in Tanzania since the 1970s, actually. Now the government is in the process of formalizing their citizenship status, which includes giving them land rights. It's not happened yet, but that's in the process, and we and the World Bank are supporting the government of Tanzania through a regional project, which will help not just these refugees who are in Burundi, but also the communities in which they are coming. So it is really important to pay attention to the communities that are in many cases bearing the burden of the refugees who come in. In fact, there have been many instances where the host communities are very unhappy with the refugees coming in and taking away the resources that they should get, or looking at these communities, the refugees getting services from the UN or from the government, but then they are just around there. They cannot access those facilities. Even schools sometimes are specifically opened for these refugees, but those communities who are there already are not able to go to those schools. So we are, from our side, using different operations, not just in Africa or in the Southern Africa region, but also more broadly in these communities that are host communities. We are working to make sure that the development is more integrated, so that there is less of a basis for new conflicts arising between the host and the arriving communities. And then also related to that is the issue of land, the disconnect, and there was a question raised about the land. How is that dealt with? In many of these countries, land is actually a communal property. It's given to villages. It's not a very little. For example, in Tanzania, 70% of the land is owned by villages, and it's only very little land that is privately held. And then as a village, you can apply to the government to get land. There are a lot of complexities, and land reform is a major issue in most of the countries we deal with. So I'm not an expert on that, but I do acknowledge the real big challenges that these countries face in terms of land management, and not just related to conflict or displacement or migrants, but just in general in the country as such. And I'll pass it on.
Thank you, Preeti. Roger Mark.
Thank you. I'll provide just some very quick responses. I would say on the question of the broader spatial and temporal perspective, I think this is something that the G7 is specifically trying to accomplish. You know, we're working with the office of the foreign assistance offices throughout the G7, and this is exactly what they're trying to bring to their work and thinking about how to mainstream that. So it has been clearly recognized in the context of foreign assistance, and they're rolling out a platform and thinking about how they can work with a broader temporal and spatial scale. With the question of people living in these communities and this sense of being resilient, it's many of these communities, when I go and work with them, they say to me, you know, Roger Mark, we're tired of being resilient. Enough. Stop calling us resilient. We want out. But yet at the same time, you know, we have worked with communities in Alaska who have voluntarily displaced themselves before a disaster has occurred. And the problem is a legal loophole because they are not able to access funding from the federal government because they are deciding to move when a disaster has not occurred. And the only way that they can access federal funding is if they relocate to where they came from. So there are huge legal loopholes that you have a community that is being anticipatory, seeing the threat, relocating as a community, and there's no support for it. So there's recognition of this, but we're paying catch up in terms of the operational and legal frameworks. On the question of large-scale investment, I think there's some of that has been done in Nepal, in the forestry sector, very difficult, very contentious. We see some of it in transboundary water and opportunities for peace building there. And then just lastly, on the question of physical sciences, I sit on the advisory board for the National Science Foundation, and we specifically have been looking at how the NSF can continue to support and increase support for bringing the physical sciences together with the social sciences. And that is really looking at building the evidence base across the world in a real way and collaborating with a significant number of European governments and research agencies to fund that kind of work. And it is meant to be very practical and applied. So that is happening. There's a strong push for that, and the NSF and the research partners in Europe are pushing to get that evidence out so it is used in a very concrete and specific way. But it's an attempt to bring the physical sciences together with social scientists in the science in the context of resilience building.
Thank you, Roger Mark. Anton.
Right. I'll try to talk to this several questions from a conflict responsive type of action. So, Yuka, to you, the regional programs that Colin was talking about, those are the programs that actually now are contributing to citizenship in Tanzania. The ones in Horn of Africa are building in environmental components and host community support. Now, it all sounds really nice, but our clients don't want to borrow either for refugees, right? So we shouldn't be too naive about it. I also think, and several of you said, this whole concept of trapped population help us to get out of here. Right? It's not about keeping us here. I think that's really trying to understand the motivations of people and how to facilitate movement in a way that is in accordance with what we pursue, which is the end, extreme poverty. And an anecdote for that related to West Africa. You know why some of the flows to Europe increased is because Côte d'Ivoire collapsed. And within ECOWAS, a lot of the migration in these regional economic commissions are to these growth areas. So, Côte d'Ivoire was key, and if people couldn't go there, then they start looking for other options. So, part of the landscapes we need to understand is the economic landscapes of people, and how to interact with that. Specific questions on land from UNEP. The work we do on pastoralism, we try to counter a bit this idea that the bank only is involved in, cadastres and ownerships and then elite capture coming from that. Some of the in the Sahel, in the Horn of Africa, it's about mobility, about livelihoods, promoting that and modernizing that. And that, I think, is where the overlap with the landscape approach and there's this circular migration. Right? Some of these landscapes are determined by circulatory migratory patterns and corridors. And I think that's the most concrete example, too, if we keep to that the title. There was one more on Mark, on your questions. How do we use hard science? Now, I'm an anthropologist, so the way we try to use it and what we try to bring to bear to it is the system analysis, because you have to understand some of the givens in that system. It is about then the resilience risk management, and very often hard science gives you the parameters of your options and gives you the projections, but leads to the last point, which is it's about scenario planning. And if there's something that we're not really good at in development practice, which was easier when you did security sector work, is scenario planning, right? And so I think the complexities we handle, there are tools to manage those, and scenario planning is one of them, resilient risk management is one of them. I think our task is to build them in to the way we do our operations. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, Tim.
Just quickly, I'll focus on I think the last two questions about large-scale investments achieving multiple goals, and then also how do we stay informed as an industry about the environment, the physical and operating environment. I think in terms of looking at investments achieving multiple goals, I would give an example of some collaborative work that's been done by Mars, Nestle, and Mondelez. So branded chocolate makers, normally fierce competitors, who've come together to co-fund investments in research into improved planting materials for cocoa, which have been shown to lead to increased productivity and, by extension of that, to increase income. Presumably that makes cocoa more attractive for people who are living in cocoa growing communities and has an impact on migration issues. Another example would be the investments that have been made in partnership with local institutions into good agricultural practices training, leading to, again, to increased productivity, but I think also more resilient farms, because farmers are taking better care of the land that they have control of. So you have better soil management practices, higher soil fertility, and so forth. So those are a couple of examples that I would give, specific examples that I think are achieving multiple goals. I think it's a great question about how do we stay informed about some of the, about some of these challenges that we're confronting. For the cocoa industry, we're in the very earliest stages, and I'll just give you an indication of how early we are. We have a board meeting near Zurich on Wednesday of next week. The climate change issue is on the agenda for that board meeting, and one of the things we're looking at tackling is the fact that there is relatively little sort of scientific data that addresses the link between climate change and cocoa. And we're looking as an industry, what we can do to start filling gaps and ultimately maybe develop some sort of industry-wide consensus about the issue. But otherwise, we rely on our partners in country to feed us admittedly anecdotal information. A few weeks ago, I was in Cote d'Ivoire, visited a cocoa farm, spoke to the farmer there who spoke about the unusually lengthy harmattan this year in West Africa. So, you know, there's anecdotal data like that, if you will, but there's so much more to be done in this space, and we would welcome partnerships, in fact, to better understand what this is all about.
Thank you very much. I think this has been a very, very rich discussion, and thank you so much for our panel members to join us. I think the topic is, as it was outlined, quite complex and challenging. And this is something that we work together on a daily basis. Perhaps we can do more together. And these events always give us a broader perspective of what others are doing, and maybe form some connections that we can use in the future. So I would like to really thank you so much, and I would like the audience to give a round of applause to our panel. Thank you for the excellent questions. We've run a little bit over time, but I think it's a good sign that there is a lot of interest in this topic. So thank you, and let's hope to work together. Thank you.